What happens when one of television's most beloved hosts walks onto a daytime talk show for what should be a light chat about his career, only to find himself under attack from a panel who seem determined to make him the villain? In just 34 seconds of airtime, what started as a friendly conversation would spiral into one of the most shocking moments in daytime television history. A moment so explosive, so uncomfortable, that it would leave viewers at home speechless. Graham Norton arrived at the Loose Women studio that morning, expecting the usual banter. He had been on countless talk shows, charmed audiences around the world, and built a reputation as one of the most gracious, funny, and warm presenters in the business. But from the moment he sat down on that sofa, something felt different. The panel that day consisted of Denise Welch, alongside regular panelists including Jane Moore, Nadia Sawalha, and Kay Adams. Graham settled into his seat with his trademark smile, ready to discuss his latest projects and share some behind-the-scenes stories from his chat show. But Denise had other plans. "So Graham," Denise began, leaning forward with a look that immediately set an uncomfortable tone, "let's talk about your show. You know, some people have been saying that you interrupt your guests quite a lot. Do you think that's fair?" Graham laughed it off, clearly thinking this was just playful ribbing. "Well, I think conversation is about flow, isn't it? Sometimes you have to guide things along, keep the energy up. But I always try to let people tell their stories." Denise wasn't satisfied with that answer. Her face hardened. "Right. But don't you think that's a bit rich? You built your entire career on letting people talk, and now you talk over them." The studio fell quiet. This wasn't the usual Loose Women friendly chat. Graham shifted in his seat, his smile fading slightly. "I'm not sure that's entirely accurate, Denise. I think if you watch the show, you'll see that guests get plenty of time to speak." Jane Moore jumped in, and her tone was just as sharp. "But Graham, we have watched the show, and honestly, there have been times where it does feel like you're more interested in getting the laugh than letting the guest finish their point." Graham's eyebrows raised. He was clearly surprised by the direction this was taking. "I appreciate the feedback, but I have to say, this feels a bit like an ambush. I came here to have a nice conversation, not to defend my interviewing style." "An ambush?" Denise scoffed, and there was real contempt in her voice now. "That's very dramatic, Graham. We're just asking you questions. Isn't that what you do for a living? Or can you only ask questions, not answer them?" The audience was completely silent. You could feel the tension radiating through the screen. Graham took a breath, clearly trying to maintain his composure. "I answer questions all the time, Denise. But there's a difference between asking questions and making accusations." Nadia Sawalha leaned forward now, piling on. "I think what Denise is trying to say is that maybe you need to be more self-aware. You're in a position of power on your show. Your guests can't exactly call you out, can they?" "My guests are some of the biggest stars in the world," Graham replied, his voice remaining calm but with an edge creeping in. "I think they're perfectly capable of standing up for themselves if they felt I was being unfair." Kay Adams, who had been quiet up until this point, decided to add her voice to the mix. "But that's the thing, Graham. They're there to promote something. They need you. So of course, they're not going to say anything. It's an unequal power dynamic." Graham looked around the panel, his expression now showing real confusion and frustration. "I'm genuinely baffled right now. I've been doing my show for years. I've interviewed thousands of people, and I've never had anyone suggest that I make them uncomfortable or don't let them speak. This is completely out of nowhere." Denise laughed, but it was a cold, mocking laugh. "Oh, come on, Graham. Don't play the victim. You're one of the biggest names on television. You can handle a little criticism, surely?" "There's criticism, and then there's whatever this is," Graham shot back, his patience clearly wearing thin. "You've basically invited me here to tear me down on national television? And for what? What did I do to deserve this?" "You didn't do anything," Denise said, her voice dripping with condescension. "We're just having a conversation. Although I have to say, you're being quite defensive. Maybe that says something about whether there's truth to what we're saying." Graham shook his head in disbelief. "That's a really unfair tactic, Denise. You make an accusation, I defend myself, and then you use my defense as proof that the accusation is true? That's not how reasonable conversation works." Jane Moore cut in again. "I think you're overreacting, Graham. We're just trying to have an honest discussion about interviewing styles. Why are you taking it so personally?" "Because you're making it personal." Graham's voice rose slightly, though he was still trying to keep control. "You're not talking about interviewing techniques in general. You're specifically attacking me and my show. How else am I supposed to take it?" Denise rolled her eyes, and the gesture was so dismissive, so disrespectful, that you could see Graham's jaw tighten. "Here we go." The poor, persecuted chat show host. "Do you know how privileged you sound right now?" "Privileged?" Graham repeated, his voice incredulous. "Denise, you're literally sitting on a panel of a national talk show, being paid to share your opinions, and you're calling me privileged because I'm defending myself against your attacks." "They're not attacks," Nadia interjected. "We're just saying that maybe you need to listen more and talk less." "That's not an attack. That's advice." "Advice I didn't ask for," Graham countered. "And advice that's being delivered in the most hostile way possible. If you genuinely wanted to have a constructive conversation about interviewing techniques, you could have approached this completely differently. But instead, you've decided to turn this into some kind of trial." Denise leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms with a smug expression. "I think the real issue here is that you can't handle being questioned. You're used to being the one in control, asking the questions, getting the laughs. And now that someone's turning the tables on you, you don't like it." Graham stared at her for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. "That's not it at all, Denise. I have no problem being questioned. I do interviews as a guest all the time. What I have a problem with is being disrespected. And that's exactly what's happening here." "Disrespected?" Denise laughed again. "Oh, please, you're being such a baby about this." That comment hung in the air like a bomb. The other panelists looked uncomfortable now, as if even they realized Denise had crossed a line. But Denise herself seemed completely unbothered, even pleased with herself. Graham's face hardened. "Did you just call me a baby?" "If the shoe fits," Denise replied with a shrug. "You're throwing a tantrum because we dared to ask you a few tough questions. What would you call that?" "I'd call it a normal human reaction to being ambushed and insulted on live television," Graham said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "And I think most reasonable people would agree with me." Jane Moore tried to jump in, perhaps sensing things were spiraling out of control. "Let's all just take a breath here. I think emotions are running a bit high." "My emotions are perfectly fine," Graham said, though his clenched jaw suggested otherwise. "What's not fine is being treated this way. I came here as a guest, in good faith, and I've been nothing but polite. And in return, I've been criticized, mocked, and now insulted. I don't think asking for basic respect is too much." Denise waved her hand dismissively. "There you go again. Everything's about you. I've been criticized. I've been mocked. I've been insulted. Maybe this is exactly why you talk over your guests. You can't stand not being the center of attention." Graham stood up suddenly, and the movement was so abrupt that the entire panel flinched. "You know what, Denise? I don't have to sit here and listen to this. I really don't." "Oh, what are you going to do?" Denise taunted. "Walk off? That'll really prove you're not oversensitive." Graham unclipped his microphone, his hands shaking slightly with suppressed anger. "I'd rather be called oversensitive than sit here and be verbally attacked for no reason. You've made it very clear that you had no intention of having a fair conversation with me. This whole thing was set up to make me look bad." Kay Adams finally spoke up, trying to defuse the situation. "Graham, please sit down. Let's talk this through." But Graham shook his head. "No, Kay, I appreciate that you're trying to be reasonable, but I'm done. I've given Denise multiple chances to have a civil conversation, and she's chosen to double down on being cruel instead. I'm not going to reward that behavior by staying. Cruel? Denise scoffed. Now you're just being ridiculous. We asked you some questions about your show. If that's cruel to you, then I don't know what to tell you. Graham looked directly at Denise, and his gaze was steady and calm despite the obvious anger in his voice. You didn't just ask questions, Denise. You came at me with accusations from the very first moment. You mocked me when I tried to explain my perspective. You dismissed my feelings when I said this felt like an ambush. And then you called me a baby when I stood up for myself. That's not journalism. That's not even good television. It's just mean. The studio was dead silent. Even Denise seemed momentarily at a loss for words, but she recovered quickly, her face twisting into a sneer. Well, if you can't handle the heat, I suppose running away is your only option. I'm not running away, Graham said firmly. I'm choosing not to participate in whatever this is. There's a difference. And honestly, I feel sorry for your future guests if this is how you treat people. Nadia tried one more time to intervene. Graham, we really didn't mean for this to escalate like this. Maybe we came on too strong. Can we start over? Graham paused, considering her words. For a moment, it seemed like he might sit back down. But then Denise spoke again. Oh, for goodness sake, stop coddling him, Nadia. He's a grown man. If he wants to storm off like a child, let him. That was it. The final straw. Graham placed his microphone on the coffee table with deliberate care. Thank you for that, Denise. You've just made my decision much easier. Where do you think you're going? Denise demanded, her voice rising. We're in the middle of a live show. Then I guess you'll have to fill the time without me, Graham replied coolly. I'm sure you're very good at talking. You've certainly done a lot of it today. Jane Moore looked genuinely distressed now. Graham, please, this has gotten out of hand. Just sit down for 5 minutes, and let's resolve this. But Graham was already walking toward the edge of the set. There's nothing to resolve, Jane. Denise has made it crystal clear what she thinks of me. And I have too much self-respect to sit here and be insulted for your viewers' entertainment. Denise called after him, her voice sharp and angry. You're being completely unprofessional. You can't just leave in the middle of a segment. Graham stopped and turned back to face the panel one last time. You want to talk about unprofessional? Let's talk about ambushing a guest with hostile questions. Let's talk about mocking someone when they try to defend themselves. Let's talk about name-calling on live television. And then tell me who's being unprofessional here. The camera captured the stunned faces of the Loose Women panel. Kay looked mortified. Jane looked upset. Nadia looked confused. But Denise just looked angry. Fine, Denise shouted. Go! Nobody's forcing you to stay. You're absolutely right, Graham agreed. And I'm exercising my choice to leave. I hope your next guest is more willing to be a punching bag than I am. As Graham walked off the set, you could hear his footsteps echoing in the silent studio. The panel sat frozen, clearly unsure of what to do next. The camera stayed on them for several long, uncomfortable seconds before finally cutting to a commercial break. When they returned from the break, Denise tried to spin the situation. Well, that was certainly unexpected. I think Graham Norton just proved exactly what we were talking about. He can dish it out, but he certainly can't take it. But Jane Moore looked uncomfortable. I think that got a bit out of hand. Maybe we were too harsh. Too harsh? Denise snapped. We asked him some valid questions, and he couldn't handle it. That's on him, not us. Kay Adams spoke carefully. I think there's a difference between asking tough questions and creating a hostile environment, and I'm not sure we stayed on the right side of that line. Denise's face flushed with anger. So now you're all turning on me? This is unbelievable. We agreed to push him a bit, to make the interview more interesting, and now that he's walked off, Suddenly, I'm the bad guy? The other panelists exchanged glances. It was clear that whatever they had agreed to beforehand, this had gone far beyond it. Nadia spoke up quietly. I don't think any of us expected it to get that heated, Denise. And I definitely didn't agree to call him names. I called him a baby because he was acting like one, Denise defended herself. He was being oversensitive and childish. Or maybe he was being a human being with feelings who didn't appreciate being attacked, Jane said, her voice firmer now. I've been thinking about what he said, and he was right. We did ambush him. From the very first question, we were on the offensive. That wasn't fair. Denise looked around at her co-panelists, clearly realizing she was losing support. You're all being ridiculous. This is a talk show. We're supposed to ask challenging questions. That's what makes good television. There's challenging questions, and then there's what we just did, Kay said. And I think we crossed a line. I think Denise crossed a line. The tension among the panel was now almost as thick as it had been with Graham. Denise sat back in her chair, arms crossed, looking furious. I can't believe you're all ganging up on me for doing my job. Your job isn't to drive guests off the set, Jane said bluntly. Your job is to have engaging conversations. And, what we just did wasn't engaging. It was uncomfortable and mean-spirited. The rest of the show was awkward, with Denise barely speaking and the other panelists trying to carry on as normal. But the damage was done. The moment had been captured, and viewers at home had seen exactly what had happened. In the immediate aftermath, Denise tried to double down on her position. During the following segment, she brought it up again. I just want to say, for anyone watching who thinks I was too hard on Graham Norton, you're wrong. He's a public figure. He can handle criticism, and if he can't, then maybe he's in the wrong profession. But Kay interrupted her. Denise, I really think we should move on. We've said enough about this. No, I haven't said enough, Denise insisted. I'm not going to sit here and be made to feel bad for asking legitimate questions. Graham Norton walked off this set because he couldn't handle a little bit of pushback. That's not my fault. Jane Moore had clearly had enough. Denise, with all due respect, it wasn't just pushback. You were hostile from the start. We all were, to varying degrees. But you took it further than anyone else. And then, when he tried to defend himself, you mocked him. When he said he was uncomfortable, you dismissed him. And when he finally stood up to leave, you insulted him again. That's not journalism. That's bullying. The word bullying hung in the air like a grenade. Denise's face went red. How dare you? I did not bully him. I asked him tough questions. You called him a baby, Nadia pointed out. On live television, after he had already made it clear he was upset. How is that not bullying? Denise stood up from the panel, her voice rising to match her anger. I am not going to sit here and be accused of bullying by my own colleagues. This is absolutely outrageous. Then maybe you should think about how your behavior looks, Jane said calmly. Because from where I'm sitting and from where our viewers are sitting, it doesn't look good. The show ended shortly after that, but the impact of what had happened would ripple far beyond that single episode. Graham Norton's walkout had been dramatic, yes, but it had also been justified. He had tried multiple times to have a reasonable conversation, to defend himself politely, to maintain his composure. And each time, he had been met with mockery, dismissal, and contempt. The heart of the matter was simple. Graham Norton had been invited as a guest, treated as a target, and then blamed for not accepting the mistreatment. He had been called oversensitive for having feelings, accused of playing the victim for expressing those feelings, and then insulted for defending himself. What made the moment so powerful was Graham's dignity in the face of it all. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't lost his temper. He hadn't resorted to insults. He had simply stood his ground, stated his boundaries clearly, and when those boundaries continued to be violated, he had removed himself from the situation. The contrast between his behavior and Denise's couldn't have been starker. Where Graham had remained mostly calm and articulate, Denise had been aggressive and dismissive. Where Graham had tried to find common ground, Denise had pushed for confrontation. Where Graham had shown restraint, Denise had shown contempt. The entire incident served as a masterclass in how not to treat a guest. Every host, every interviewer, every person with a platform should know that there's a difference between asking tough questions and creating a hostile environment. There's a difference between challenging someone's ideas and attacking their character. There's a difference between good television and cruelty disguised as entertainment. Graham Norton understood those differences. He had built his career on making guests feel comfortable, drawing out their best stories, and creating an atmosphere of warmth and fun. Even when he asked cheeky or probing questions, it was always with a twinkle in his eye, always with an underlying respect for the person across from him. Denise Welch, in that moment, showed none of that understanding. She had been given the opportunity to have a fascinating conversation with one of television's most beloved figures. She could have asked about his career, his techniques, his memorable interviews. She could have gently probed any criticisms while still maintaining respect. She could have created a moment of real insight and entertainment. Instead, she chose aggression. She chose mockery. She chose to make a guest feel small and attacked. And when that guest stood up for himself, she chose to double down rather than reflect. The most telling part of the entire encounter was the reaction of the other panelists. Initially, they had gone along with the hostile questioning, perhaps thinking it would make for spicy television. But as the situation escalated, you could see them pulling back, recognizing that things had gone too far. By the end, even they were distancing themselves from Denise's behavior. Jane Moore's comment about bullying was particularly significant. It took courage to call out a colleague on live television like that. But she clearly felt that the line had been crossed so severely that staying silent would have been worse than speaking up. The moment also highlighted something important about power dynamics on talk shows. Denise had accused Graham of having an unfair power dynamic with his guests, of being able to control the conversation because he was the host. But in that moment on Loose Women, she had wielded her power as a panel member to gang up on a single guest. She had used her position to attack rather than to enlighten. She had turned what should have been a fun segment into an ordeal. Graham's decision to walk off wasn't weakness. Despite Denise's attempts to frame it that way, it was strength. It was a man saying, "I will not accept being treated this way," and following through with action. It was a refusal to play along with a game that was rigged against him from the start. Throughout the entire confrontation, Graham had tried to be reasonable. He had answered questions. He had explained his position. He had attempted to redirect the conversation toward something more constructive. At every turn, Denise had blocked those attempts, steering things back toward conflict. When Graham pointed out that he felt ambushed, Denise dismissed it. When he said he was being attacked, Denise called him dramatic. When he expressed that he deserved respect, Denise mocked him. She had created an impossible situation where anything Graham said or did would be used as evidence against him. If he defended himself, he was being defensive. If he tried to laugh it off, he wasn't taking it seriously. If he got upset, he was being oversensitive. If he stayed calm, he was being dismissive. There was no winning move available to him, except the one he ultimately chose, which was to remove himself from the situation entirely. The phrase, "if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen," was essentially what Denise was suggesting. But the heat wasn't coming from tough questions or challenging discourse. The heat was coming from personal attacks and deliberate antagonism, and no one should be expected to sit in that kitchen and smile about it. Graham Norton's walkout was a reminder that guests are people, not content to be exploited. They have feelings, boundaries, and the right to be treated with basic human dignity. The fact that someone is a celebrity or a public figure doesn't give anyone license to be cruel to them. What happened on Loose Women that day wasn't an interview gone wrong. It was a deliberate attempt to provoke and humiliate a guest for entertainment value. And when that guest refused to play along, when he stood up and said, "I deserve better than this," he didn't just stand up for himself. He stood up for every guest who had ever been mistreated on a talk show. Every person who had ever been told they were too sensitive for having boundaries. Every individual who had been blamed for the cruelty directed at them. The walkout lasted only a minute or two in real time, but the implications stretched far beyond those moments. It was a statement about respect, about dignity, about the line between entertainment and exploitation. And it was a statement delivered not with bombast or fury, but with quiet determination. Graham Norton could have stayed. He could have sat there and taken it, smiled through the insults, laughed off the attacks. Many people in his position would have done exactly that, not wanting to make waves or seem difficult. But he chose differently. He chose to value himself over the show. He chose his self-respect over being agreeable. And in doing so, he revealed something essential about Denise Welch's approach. Her anger at his departure, her insistence that he was wrong to leave, her attempts to paint him as unprofessional. All of it showed that she believed guests owed something to the show, that they were supposed to endure whatever treatment they received, because that's what being a good sport meant. But being a good sport doesn't mean accepting abuse. It doesn't mean sitting silently while someone tears you down. It doesn't mean sacrificing your dignity for someone else's idea of entertainment. Graham Norton understood that. Denise Welch clearly didn't. The really remarkable thing about the whole incident was how it vindicated Graham's decision in real time. Every time Denise spoke after he left, she proved his point. Her defensiveness, her refusal to accept any responsibility, her attempts to gaslight both her colleagues and the viewers into thinking she had done nothing wrong, all of it demonstrated exactly why he had been right to leave. If she had been genuinely interested in having a fair conversation, she would have been horrified that her guest felt attacked enough to walk out. She would have reflected on her approach. She would have acknowledged that perhaps she had pushed too hard. Instead, she doubled down, insisting she was right and everyone else was wrong. That reaction told viewers everything they needed to know. This wasn't about asking tough questions or creating interesting television. This was about Denise Welch's ego and her inability to accept that she had gone too far. The walkout became a defining moment, not just for that episode of Loose Women, but for understanding how guests should be treated on television. Graham Norton's calm but firm departure sent a clear message to hosts everywhere. You can challenge your guests. You can ask difficult questions, but you cannot strip them of their dignity and expect them to thank you for it. What viewers witnessed that day was a masterclass in standing up for oneself. Graham didn't need to shout or cause a scene. He simply recognized that he was in a toxic situation and removed himself from it. That's not running away. That's self-preservation. That's knowing your worth.